wife and I went to an event. She was a passenger. It was a big event that I had organized. It was a benefit event. We had people coming from all over. I organized it magnificently. We had hundreds of bikes. We met in this big schoolyard in Santa Cruz. And I get all the bikes in the line. We had a police escort. We're ready to go. We all take off, perfectly organized. Get about 5-6 miles away, and my buddy rides up next to me and he says, "Hey, you left your wife back at the school." It's most memorable because she won't let me forget it.
In 1981, where I took off for 17 days on a motorcycle trip and traveled to 8 western states and numerous national parks, Canada, and camped out every night. And in Yellowstone National Park, had a bear come through my camp and try and visit my tent.
I was riding out of Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, and I got lost, and I ended up accidentally riding into Cambodia without realizing it, crossing a border that wasn't marked or controlled or anything. And when I tried to cross back into Malaysia, I got stopped by a couple of young men, teenagers, with an old army jeep and very ill-fitting uniforms, and carrying AK-47 machine guns, who didn't speak English and didn't want to let me cross the border. Anyway, they wanted my papers. It just so happened that I was carrying 2 passports too, so I gave them my old passport. So they were yelling at me and going through my luggage and everything else, and motioned to me that I had to stay there with the bike, and he also motioned that he had my passport, so I wasn't going anywhere. Little did he know, I didn't care what happened to that passport because I had a second one anyway. Simply started my bike, threw it into gear, and took off for Malaysia.
Ryan did through the Malibu Canyons, and I had recently come back from a trip to Italy, and sure enough, I'm coming through Malibu off of Encino Canyon Road, headed toward the coast, and literally I thought I was in Italy at that point.
November 5th, 1966. Why do I remember that? Because it is the first ride that I took on a motorcycle with a fairing. Fairing is a windshield like splits the wind around you. It's the first fairing I ever saw. It's one I designed and made and finished that day and drove and experienced what it was like to drive a fairing for the first time ever.
I was riding back from the West Coast, and I was so relaxed. It was a beautiful day, and I was just tooling along in the right-hand lane. And it was a 2 or 3 lane highway, and when I was so comfortable that I was just swinging as I went back and forth if I changed lanes. And I wanted to get into the left lane and pass the guy in front of me. I saw a truck coming, put my blinker on, I waited, and when he got past me, I was just getting ready to go. When I glanced in my mirror and noticed he had a second trailer behind me. This was probably at 70 miles an hour. So I just started to go like that, and I looked, and I straightened up, and my stomach went up into my throat, and I have never forgotten it to this day. It was startling.
All the way back to like 10 or 12 years old and visiting family in Iowa and just being let loose on a farm, like growing up as an urban girl, and suddenly we're let loose on this farm and finding this old scrambler in a barn somewhere and just kicking it over and having it like roar into life and jumping on it and being able to ride these fields and the smell of hay in my nose and just the feeling of freedom.
So every year a bunch of guys on Ducatis get together and we ride somewhere, and it's called Madness. It started as Reefer Madness because we met at Capitol Reef in Utah. So we decided to all go out there, and we got about 6 guys all riding together, and we were riding out, and we were riding on this spine of a road coming up to Capitol Reef, and it climbs and it climbs and it climbs, and I'd finally gotten fairly good at riding, and we're all riding pretty fast, and we're riding on this ridge that it falls off on both sides into this unbelievable landscape of the Utah desert, of all the colors of oranges and yellows and everything. And we're all having great fun, and we're all riding real fast. And you get up to the ridge, and it just drops off, and there's this huge empty valley, and the road just drops out behind. And we all just had to pull off because we were just all so giddy and laughing and so forth. But that's probably the most memorable, because we're, with a bunch of guys, finally figured out how to ride really well, really fast, and we're out in the middle of frickin' nowhere, just a bunch of middle-aged guys just being children and hooligans all over again.
I went to a riding school at Laguna Seca Raceway, which is up in Monterey. And it was a women's only day, and it was a track class where you learn how to race on a racetrack. And I brought my own bike, and I'd always watched people race on this track, and it was like, wow, this one set of corners called the corkscrew was just made my heart flip-flop every time I saw somebody ride it. Well, this was my first opportunity for me to ride it, and I thought going around the track the first time, I'm going, either I'm going to really like this, or I'm really going to hate it, because it was so scary to watch people do it. Well, the first time I came around that corner and I dropped down 8 stories and went around those corners, it was like, oh, goodness. That was just the greatest feeling, and I just had so much fun all day long, and that was one of the best motorcycle days that I've had in 30 years.
When I was racing, I was riding for Harley Davidson. I was primarily a road racer. This was at the Heidelberg National in 1968, and I was a contender at Heidelberg. And I remember it was a really punk and roller track. It was a half mile with a quarter mile on the inside of it, and you used turns 1, 2, 3, and 4 of the half mile, and then you ducked into the infield and did turns 4, 3, 2, and 1 of the quarter mile, and then back out onto the half mile. It looked like a kind of a kidney shaped thing. And Gary Nixon was number 1 that year. Cal Rayburn was a real contender for number 1, the next year. And I remember running with them in practice and telling Cal Rayburn, my teammate, that every time I flick it off into this corner to go back out onto the half mile, I would catch the primary cover and pick the rear wheel off the ground. I actually did that, but that concerned him so much that he kept looking over his shoulder, because I was right behind him all the time. Nixon knew it as well, and they were so worried about me losing the bike and running into them that their focus was off, and I just motored right under them and went on to win the race. So that was my first and only national win in 6 or so years of racing, and I think that was probably the most memorable as far as racing is concerned.
So I'm traveling west from Chicago trying to beat the freeze. There's a storm blowing, and I'm on a two-wheeler, and I can only ride from maybe 9:30 in the morning when the ice melts until 5 p.m. when the sun starts to go down. So I'm trying to make time. Well, somewhere in western Montana. I'm hungry and I haven't eaten for a while, and I see this sign, restaurant, famous restaurant. So I turn off. Old man sitting on a bench, and how you doing? Nice bike, etc. But I want to cut him off and get rolling, but he presses on me, and he wants to tell me about the buffalo herds and when the trains came through, and he's been around there for, who knows, 80, 90 years in that valley, and has all this history. And I, instead of listening to him, I'm thinking, I need to get going. I need to shut him off and get going. And the reason that this is memorable is because when that kind of serendipity bumps into you, you need to recognize it, take your schedule and tear it up, and listen to what you get, because you don't get these windows every moment.
Okay, so not to sound schmaltzy, but it's the moment that I'm on the bike. It's any moment. A little schmaltzy. But I got into motorcycling, I just sort of backed into it. It was an accident. A girlfriend called up and said, would you take this training course with me? And this was not quite a year after my husband died and a few months shy of my 50th birthday. And right before the course, she chokes, totally chokes. So I asked my daughter, and I said, "Do you want to go on this motorcycle training course?" She laughed. She goes, "Yeah, sure." So we both went, and she'd had a little experience on a quad, and I was the only one in the course that had no experience whatsoever. There were 3 women and 6 guys, but I had 10 times the fun of anybody there. I was like, "This is so much fun! How come you never told me this is so great?" And I was totally hooked.
The most memorable moment on my motorcycle was when I had my 6-year-old son on the front of my 250cc dirt bike, and we were going on a back fire road, very heavily traveled, very deep in mud. And it was the first time I'd been out on the road on a dirt bike. We're riding along, and it's his first time riding with me, and we came to a stop behind my neighbor and his son, and I put my feet down in extremely heavy mud, and I was leaning a little bit to the side, and I felt like, uh-oh, there's no way I'm going to hold my motorcycle up. My foot started to slip in the mud, and there was absolutely no way that I could stop it. I slowly leaned further and further to the side. I looked at my son and said, "Travis, we're going down." Next thing we know, we're laying in the mud, covered in mud. And it was quite a memorable experience. I will never forget it. It happened at least 20 years ago.
You come over here and I'm gonna kick your ass. Oh my God. I started riding a bike in 2005 at the age of 48 years old. I never went more than 50 miles all by myself. I taught myself, and then all of a sudden I found this group here today. They were meeting in Barstow in Southern California, and I had to ride my motorcycle alone from San Francisco all the way to Barstow, and it took me 2 days. And I stayed right behind a semi for 3/4 of the way there. I was so scared. The semi was my guardian angel. And I stayed behind him and he protected me. He finally had to get off on an exit and he blew his horn signaling, "I gotta go." And I tooted my horn and it sounded like a kazoo in a tin can. I don't even know if he heard it over his engine. So I made it the rest of the way to Barstow.
What are you doing?
And I met the group and they took me all the way to Colorado. And it was like the most awesome thing in my entire life. I don't know. It's awesome.
I went on a trip to the Alps, and I was in Germany and Switzerland, and I had been riding for like 9 days with the guide. And I was probably the slowest person, and I went on a few rides with the guys, really fast in the twisties, and I'm a good rider. But at the last day, on the last set of turns, he said, "Follow me." And him and I took off, and we went down through the Swiss Alps as fast as he could go. And I trusted him so much, I stayed right behind him. We were going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, passing cars on outsides of curves on just incredible turns. And the Swiss cows with cowbells clang, 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 clang in the road. We get all the way down to this beautiful resort. I get off the bike and I am just trembling with adrenaline.
In October of 2007, the very first time I rode my motorcycle, which is what I just learned to ride, down the hill from Big Bear Lake, all the way down, and I rode down the whole time going, "Oh my God, I'm doing it, I'm doing it. I can ride a motorcycle, I'm doing it, I'm doing it." 50 billion miles later, here I am today. Done.
My most memorable motorcycle moment was the time that my friend stole his brother's Kawasaki H1 Mach 3 500 when we were about 15 years old. And we went on a ride. I was on the back. We rode through Santiago Canyon in Orange County and didn't kill ourselves wearing flip-flops, t-shirts, and no helmets. That's my most memorable motorcycle moment.